that binds us together as human beings in the responsibility that we take towards the world. And obviously the potential, the positive potential of an act of judgment depends on the degree to which it is based on experience, on reflection, and impartiality. But just because sometimes you and I make judgments that are short-sighted, maybe even based on prejudice, not having actually thought about it, just because we do that sometimes, it's not an argument against judgment, it's merely an argument to see judgment as being more important than we think it is. It seems to me that one of the things that has occurred, particularly in cultural politics in the 21st century, is that the virtue of judgment has been trumped by the idea of respect. And the number of times I hear people saying respect me, or how respect has got to be almost provided as a kind of default position. So that respect is not something that you have to earn, not something that you gain in virtue of what you've done. Respect, it seems to be almost like what you give to people in order to demonstrate that you're a human being. And it seems to me that in a world where we live, what tends to have happened is that we tend to believe that our job as citizens is not so much to judge one another, but to validate one another. And I think that validation and respect has come to be seen as a first-order principle, a first-order ideal to which everything needs to be subordinated. And the significance attached to respect and validation, in other words, to not judging but to validate, the significance that's given to that also means that as a result of that, speech, particularly free speech, has been implicitly reduced into a second-order principle. The second-order principle, because free speech is increasingly perceived as subject to a variety of external contingencies. Free speech is increasingly visualized as something that's okay as long as it's harmless. It's okay as long as it doesn't offend. It's okay as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. But the minute it calls into question the moral status, it calls into question the existence of a particular ideal and of a person, then it becomes something that is really, really dangerous. And I think it's very sad the way that, for example, offensive speech, the right to offend, is now regarded as dangerous, and that somehow all you have to say is "I'm offended. This is really offensive. I'm really offended," and that's sufficient to close down discussion. Right? That's sufficient to close down discussion. And just think about that. Think back over the last 2,000 years. Can you think of a single important idea that emerged in the course of human history that didn't offend somebody? I mean, imagine you're a Catholic, right? A Catholic in Galileo's time, and all of a sudden you hear all these, ideas that fundamentally contradict your theology. It must have really been offensive to the Pope. It must have been really offensive to the Church. If you go on from there all the way to the present, every important radical idea has always offended somebody, and I think, it basically means that, offending becomes really quite important. One of the things that I find quite curious as a sociologist is that we are so obsessed with our right not to be offended, and our right not to be judged, and our right not to be criticized, that our existential security has become deeply entwined with that. And you have this situation where, because of our inward-looking ideals of existence, we become almost unaware of the fact that the people that we don't like, the people that are criticizing us, are feeling pretty much in the same way as we do. And it's really interesting that finding the culture wars that are being conducted in not just in the United States but almost everywhere, where both sides of the argument are using essentially the same intellectual apparatus. But they don't recognize that. It's almost as if people on one side have become totally, sort of desensitized from the way that the other people feel. So, for example, it's okay for universities like Goldsmith College to have safe spaces. And it's okay for safe spaces to be called, because people need a space where they're not judged, they're not criticized, where they feel secure from all the kind of criticism and the hurt they get. So when people demonstrate and argue for safe spaces, that's all right. But when President Trump more or less says the same thing and chants, build that wall, build that wall, and have you heard him demanding build that wall? Yeah. In other words, when he wants a bigger safe space for the American people, and where he gives his version of that, that is seen as racist, and that is seen as a whole lot of different kind of things, and vice versa. They both sides make equal kind of fun of each other all along the line. And I think what also unites both sides in the 21st century is that both sides have drawn the conclusion that what they really like, what they really signed up to, is not tolerance, but zero tolerance. I don't know if you ever heard the expression zero tolerance. It's a contradiction in term. What is zero tolerance? I mean, zero judging, that's possibly what it could be. But what zero tolerance means, and what's really important about it, is that when you say we're for zero tolerance policies, zero tolerance is really important. What you actually are saying is not being tolerant is a good thing. That's what Cameron means when we have zero tolerance for Islamic ideas in the university. Zero tolerance, as if somehow that becomes a virtue in and of itself. And when people on all sides talk about zero tolerance for this view or that view, what they are really expressing is that ultimately their commitment to judgment and their commitment to freedom is actually paper thin. That's ultimately what it's really all about. And in a sense, what we're forgetting about is that freedom, as Hannah Arendt reminds us, comes from the capacity for action and real action. But for effective action to occur, we need to be able to judge and judge independently. For Hannah Arendt, action which brings about freedom anew at every single stage depends on our capacity for independently judging. And it's for that reason that I think that we should be concerned about this, because if we are going to opt for zero tolerance or put conditions on tolerance, what we are forgetting is that what also goes by the window is action, and the kind of action that is freedom producing. And if action that is freedom producing goes by the sidelines, then what we are saying is that we are prepared to defer to fate. I mean, the flip side of avoiding the making of judgment and its independent action-related developments is that we defer to fate. And what we end up, in a sense, is a modern 21st version of the Thatcherite ideal of there is no alternative. There is really no alternative. It's all Tina. Because the only alternative to Tina has always been our preparedness and our capacity to act, and to not just simply to act, but to act in such a way that we give freedom a 21st century contemporary content. I'll stop here and take criticism from you.
Yeah, okay. So Alex, go ahead.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I do understand what you're problematizing and what you're trying to do, but I do find that with some of the examples, I think it's extrapolating to extremes to demonstrate something, such as conflating Catholics being offended by Galileo to say some Canadian pseudo-psychologists saying we need to reconsider gender pronouns, or speaking about safe spaces and building a wall where safe spaces, arguably constructed people for the threat of rape is palpable and real, as opposed to like jingoistic triumphalism and xenophobia towards Mexicans. It's kind of I can't see the sort of theoretical leap from one, I get you saying there's sort of similar modes of rhetoric from each side, but I think it's probably, I'm not just going to say problematic because you